It's a particularly strange coincidence, but there were actually two German illustrators called Hermann Vogel, born only 2 years apart, and next to nothing is known about either of them. One Vogel went to live and work in Paris, but the Vogel of greater interest is this one, who stayed put in Germany. He studied at the Academy of Art in Dresden, and in 1878 began producing monochrome illustration for a local publisher. And not much later he started contributing to Fliegende Blätter, a satirical publication which quickly recognised Vogel's exceptional talents. Like most of his contemporaries, Vogel at this point was illustrating exclusively in monochrome. Limited colour applied at the printing stage was technically possible, but not cost efficient for most magazines. Consequently, Vogel's style was very much in the Victorian European tradition, with an ornate and highly detailed crosshatch technique which had to undergo the process of engraving in order to be printed. But in Vogel's case, some of the shading work is so fine it's more than likely he used the more subtle lithographic etching process on quite a few of his images too. Vogel was a natural choice for children's illustration, and his work appeared in an 1881 publication of fairy tales by Hans Christian Andersen. And in the coming years up to the end of the 19th century, he illustrated several more Northern European folk stories, all of which were highly successful and critically well received. His style was remarkably well suited to the task, creating atmospheric, visually absorbing images, with border work and lettering which only added to the authentic traditional look of the illustrations. Vogel had particular success with the panoramic fairy tale processions he created, which were printed in this concertina format in 1898. And although they did feature colour, it was rather crudely applied and added nothing to the visual quality of the work. Nevertheless, it marked a turning point, and the impact of full colour on Vogel's later work was profound. He quickly developed a technique in which there was a sophisticated blend of colour washes which worked with the foundation of his linear style to produce particularly three-dimensional, believable fantasy characters using watercolour and ink. Vogel didn't abandon black and white completely, but from here onwards he took every opportunity to explore the possibilities of colour, and he created a remarkable and absorbing body of influential illustration, most of which explored the German and Nordic myths he was so inspired by, up to his death in 1921. As a young boy, American illustrator Newell Convers Wyeth showed a remarkable ability to draw and paint, and in 1902, at the age of 20, he was accepted to Howard Pyle's prestigious School of Art. Within a year, Wyeth had his first major commission, a bucking bronco duotone illustration for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. More requests for Western-themed illustrations soon came his way, and at Pyle's suggestion, Wyeth headed out to the West to gain first-hand experience and bring greater believability to his work. So Wyeth spent a few months in Colorado working on a cattle ranch, and by his own account he enjoyed this experience so much he returned several times and created many convincing evocations of the West and its inhabitants. Commissions were by now coming in thick and fast, and with the money he made he settled his family in a grand rural home and studio with 18 acres of land. In the early years of the 20th century, most of Wyeth's work was for magazines, and in addition to the Post, he created images for several others. His monochrome and duotone illustrations appeared regularly in the pages of Century and Scribner's, and there were many full-colour covers for the Popular magazine. Wyeth gravitated increasingly towards illustrating classic books, and his first was an edition of Treasure Island in 1911. Which made him enough money to pay off his mortgage. And in the following decade he worked his way through many others, including Kidnapped, The Last of the Mohicans, Robinson Crusoe, and a particularly evocative version of Rip Van Winkle in 1921. All were successful and critically acclaimed, and in his lifetime he illustrated the covers and contents of more than 100 books. Wyeth frequently complained about prostituting his artistic soul with commercial work, but it didn't stop him taking on even more lucrative work for generous clients including Lucky Strike and Coca-Cola. By the 1930s, Wyeth the artist devoted himself increasingly to painting seascapes, but he never did leave illustration completely behind. And that's how it continued for Wyeth until 1945, when unfortunately both he and his young grandson were killed in a car accident. And despite his own pompous misgivings, it's the illustration work which endures. Alberto Fabio Lorenzi was born in Florence in 1880, and once again, other than a couple of odds and ends of information, very little is known about his life. But we do have quite a lot of pictures. Lorenzi spent his early career as a fine artist, painting in oils without much success. In 1910 he relocated to Paris, hoping to make a name for himself in its bustling, decadent artistic community. And he did, but as an illustrator, not an artist. And in that capacity he soon found himself working regularly for a couple of prestigious Paris fashion magazines. After the First World War and throughout the 1920s, he went on to forge working relationships with high-profile French humour and lifestyle magazines such as Fantasio, Le Sourire, and most importantly, La Vie Parisienne. Lorenzi quickly became a regular with his Art Deco-styled erotic humour and pin-ups. Virtually all Lorenzi's output featured languidly posed attractive females, and most of his work was produced in colour, which he applied in a range of methods from the entirely flat, limited palette and duotone style that was widely used in magazines at that time, through to more highly rendered tonal full colour work, all of which he handled with apparent ease. And when working in monochrome, his precise linear approach demonstrated an innate understanding of aesthetic balance. Lorenzi was among the first in Paris to work in an Art Deco style, and he enjoyed considerable success with it. But from the 30s onward, demand for his illustration work slowly but surely began to decline. And as the commissions dried up, Lorenzi attempted to ride out the storm by resuming his original career as an artist, but with a similar lack of success. And consequently he died in relative poverty in 1964, all but forgotten. American Rockwell Kent was one of very few of his generation with little to no interest in conventional representational painting. Kent was a 20th century Renaissance man, a painter, printmaker, illustrator, writer and adventurer. As a young man he studied architecture at Columbia University, but in the early years of his career it was art which was the dominant force in his life, and he painted and exhibited his landscapes with success, selling enough to make a good living. In 1918, Kent and his 9-year-old son ventured to the frozen wastelands of Alaska. He published his illustrated account as Wilderness in 1920 to great acclaim, and it was to be the first of quite a few other similar adventures. In 1926, Kent was commissioned to illustrate an edition of Herman Melville's tale of the great white whale Moby Dick. It was published in 1930 as a particularly expensive limited edition filled with Kent's haunting, brutally styled black and white drawings, and it sold out immediately. This did his reputation no harm at all in literary circles, and he was approached by several other publishers to visually translate other classics of literature, including the works of Shakespeare in 1939. 10 years later there was the unlikely choice of Boccaccio's Decameron, and Kent produced some remarkably desaturated colour images along with the expected monochromes to illustrate the generally bawdy tales. Stylistically, Kent tended towards folk art, and much of his monochrome work was created from woodcuts, with predominant use of black giving everything a dark and slightly sinister illumination. Kent's politics were known to be radically left of centre, but this didn't stop him occasionally getting his hands dirty with overtly commercial work, including various press campaigns for wealthy clients. And and it was only in this context where his full-colour oil painting style was used. Other than these rare occasions, Kent's illustration was almost exclusively monochrome, and where colour was applied, it tended to be limited and restrained. And although he continued to paint, illustrate and write, as he grew older, predictably there was less and less adventure for Kent, and he died from a heart attack in 1971. I've featured John Held Jr. a couple of times in other videos, but his work is particularly distinctive and easily worthy of inclusion here too. Held was born and grew up in Salt Lake City, where he spent all his time learning to draw. Consequently, he never graduated from high school, but had sold his first nationally published cartoon to Life magazine at the age of 15. In 1912, he relocated to New York and produced illustration for pretty much anyone who would pay him. In 1915, Held got his first big break when Vanity Fair began publishing his highly stylized cartoon drawings. This led to other magazines seeking him out, and in the years that followed, his work also appeared in any number of other magazines, including Harper's Bazaar and Judge. But it was his relationship with Life magazine which was to prove the most successful, and Held created any number of cheerful Art Deco style covers, celebrating the whims and foibles of the Jazz Age and those who populated it. He also wrote and drew distinctively styled geometric newspaper comic strips, Omargy being the most popular of these. Writer of the age F. Scott Fitzgerald was particularly taken with Held's Deco approach, and he instructed his publisher to use Held to illustrate several of Fitzgerald's novels, which were published in the 20s. When anyone remembers John Held at all, it's invariably for these Jazz Age cartoons, but at the time he was almost equally popular for his comical pastiches of 19th century woodcut style. From 1925 to 1932, these cartoons, which were actually lino cuts, were published frequently in the New Yorker, and his work for that magazine was exclusively using this technique. And it wasn't just used for editorial work. Several successful ad campaigns relied on these witty and highly decorative illustrations. Held's Deco style also spawned quite a bit of advertising work, and even merchandising such as cocktail shakers and drinks trays. Unfortunately for Held, he was a serious casualty of the Great Depression, and he lost much of his wealth and his palatial home following the Wall Street crash. Not long after, his second wife divorced him. Held didn't throw in the towel though, and although his last New Yorker illustration was published in 1932, he wrote and illustrated several of his own books and even tried his hand at children's stories, but not with significant success. He had much better luck as a painter, and his urban landscapes sold well enough even if he could never recapture his earlier success. And he died in 1958, financially solvent but with his best years well and truly behind him. And on that cautionary note, I'll see you next time.